Consent of the governed is a lie. We're continuing our deep dive into the Most Dangerous Superstition by Larken Rose, focusing on the next 3 powerful arguments that build directly on the foundation we explored last time. Picture this. What if the very words we use every day, the comforting stories we tell ourselves about consent and representation, are all carefully designed to hide a simple truth we've been trained never to see? What if the belief in authority doesn't just create evil, but also gives itself the perfect camouflage so we never notice it's there? That's exactly where we're going in this episode. No slogans, just raw, unflinching logic that cuts straight through every defense. If any of this hits you deep, those raw truths or sudden lightbulb moments, drop a comment, tell a friend, and stay with us for more. Let's get right into it. The 4th core argument is that the superstition of authority spreads through language itself. Everyday words become loaded weapons that disguise coercion as something legitimate and even noble. Think about it. When an ordinary person demands money at gunpoint, we call it extortion or robbery. When the same act is performed by someone claiming authority, we call it taxation. When a thug harasses, kidnaps, or assaults people, it's called crime. When the same actions are carried out under the banner of authority, they're renamed regulation and law enforcement. The words themselves train us to apply completely different moral standards to identical behavior depending on who is doing it. Even the word country doesn't really mean a land or a people. It means the piece of ground that one particular gang claims the moral right to rule. Language doesn't just describe the superstition. It actively protects it by making the irrational feel normal and the immoral feel righteous. The 5th argument takes apart one of the most cherished defenses of authority: the myth of consent. People like to say that government is legitimate because it rests on the consent of the governed. But Rose shows this is logically impossible. Consent and governing are opposites. If there is genuine mutual consent, then by definition there is no governing. There is only voluntary cooperation. If there is actual governing, meaning one party forcing its will on another, then consent cannot exist. You cannot consent to be forced against your will. The idea that a majority can consent on behalf of a minority is equally absurd. I cannot consent for you to be robbed or controlled. And the fallback claim of implied consent, that by living somewhere you automatically agree to obey, collapses completely. That's not consent. That's declaring that politicians own the entire territory and everyone in it. It turns every country into a giant slave plantation where the masters don't even need your explicit agreement. True consent is mutual, voluntary, and revocable at any time. Authority, by its nature, is none of those things. The 6th argument dismantles the remaining comforting myths that keep the illusion alive. Phrases like, "We are the government works for us," and "representative government" are not descriptions of reality. They are deliberate illusions meant to obscure the master-slave relationship. In truth, there is a ruling class that issues commands and a subject class that obeys. One group takes money by force, the other pays it. One group makes the rules, the other is punished for breaking them. No amount of feel-good language changes that basic fact. Representation fails for an even deeper reason. A true representative cannot have more rights than the person he represents. Since no individual has the right to tax, regulate, or control his neighbor, he cannot possibly grant that right to a politician. The moment government does these things, it stops representing anyone and simply rules them. These slogans don't reflect how power actually works. They exist to make the ruled feel better about being ruled. Now let's sit with these ideas and destroy every common counterargument with nothing but pure logic. People often push back by saying that language is just language. Words like law and taxation are simply convenient labels and don't change the underlying reality. But that misses the point entirely. The words don't just label. They reprogram moral judgment. They create a mental split where the exact same act is evil when done by one person and virtuous when done by another. If the words had no power, people would react with horror to taxation, regulation, and law enforcement the same way they react to robbery and assault. The fact that they don't shows the language is successfully hiding the superstition in plain sight. Denying the power of language here is like denying the power of propaganda. It only works if you pretend it doesn't exist. On the consent myth, the usual reply is that by choosing to stay in a society you implicitly accept its rules. But logic destroys this instantly. Staying somewhere does not equal agreement to be ruled any more than staying in a neighborhood means you agree to let the local gang rob you. If someone claims ownership over an entire territory and says your only choices are obey or leave, they are asserting total ownership over your life and property. That is the definition of slavery, not consent. And since there is no place on earth where you can escape some form of claimed authority, the love it or leave it argument simply means you must choose your master, never that you are actually free. True consent requires the real option to say no without punishment. Authority never allows that option. When it comes to the representation and "we are the government" myths, people often fall back on the idea that even if imperfect, it's the best system we have for reflecting the will of the people. But this collapses under basic reasoning. If the government truly represented the people, it would never do things that large numbers of those people oppose. Yet it constantly does. More fundamentally, representation cannot create new rights. If you don't have the moral right to tax or control your neighbor, you cannot magically transfer that right to someone else through a vote or a piece of paper. The entire concept of representative government assumes that rights can be delegated that no one actually possesses. That is not representation, it is the invention of rights out of thin air. The comforting slogans exist only to let people avoid facing the raw truth. They are not being served, they are being ruled. These three arguments together expose how the superstition survives. It hides in our language, it hides behind false claims of consent, and it hides behind feel-good myths of representation. Strip those away, and what remains is the naked reality of one group claiming the moral right to dominate everyone else. Once you see the mechanism, you can't unsee it. Let me share some of the clearest lines that drive these points home. On language, what might be called extortion, if done by the average citizen, is called taxation, when done by people who are imagined to have the right to rule. On consent, if there is mutual consent, it is not government. If there is governing, there is no consent. And on the representation myth, a ruling class cannot serve or represent those it rules any more than a slave owner can serve or represent his slaves. What stays with you after wrestling with these ideas is how thoroughly they expose the mental traps we've all been taught to live inside. The superstition doesn't just justify violence. It rewires our entire perception so we don't even recognize the violence for what it is. It turns moral wrongs into sacred duties and turns free human beings into willing participants in their own subjugation. If any of this resonates, if it makes you look at the daily rituals and justifications around you with fresh eyes, then the real work begins right now. Start noticing the loaded language. Start questioning every claim of consent. Start seeing through the comforting myths that keep the illusion alive. The book doesn't hand you a new system to believe in. It simply hands you the clarity to stop believing in the old one. And that clarity is where everything changes. Thanks for thinking through this with me today. If these ideas hit you the way they hit me, keep turning them over. Talk about them. Test them against everything you see. The world doesn't change because we swap one set of rulers for another. It changes when enough of us stop pretending the rulers were ever legitimate in the first place. I'll catch you next time. Keep questioning. Stay free.